Hey everybody, it's Max J. Miller, co-author with Robert Hollis of the upcoming How Is That Working? So I want to talk today about a sort of a higher level subject than I've been discussing. It is sort of the very topic that I've been talking about, which is story itself. Now, human beings have an amazing relationship with storytelling. And as you get to know me, you'll know that I think that human beings are sort of defined by storytelling. That's kind of what makes us really, really unique, is the fact that we have this imagination and that we utilize it. Sometimes we utilize it and we don't even know we're utilizing it. That our fear and our faith are both acts of imagination, and they're basically believing stories that have been told and that we buy into, both whether that's faithful buying in or fearful buying in. And it just depends on the ending of that particular story that you're believing. So the question is, why do we do this? Why are we so wrapped up in stories? Well, I think there's many different points of view on this, and now with the recent brain research, there's a lot of new information that's coming out. Functional MRIs have given us a whole new insight into the functioning of the brain and how we think and how our brain works. One perspective, which I will attribute to, there's many people who believe this, but my friend Craig McNair Wilson, I introduced his book to you a while ago, Hatch. He often says that the gift of storytelling is inherently human, because human beings are made in the image of God, and God is a storyteller. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And there's a whole bunch of references to, God spoke in Genesis. He spoke and there was light. He said, "Let there be light." And his speaking brought things into existence. So he says. So McNair says, God is the great storyteller, and some of his stories are simply divine, and we follow in his footsteps. We not to anthropomorphize God too much, but that we are storytellers because we're created by a storyteller. Another perspective is that when you look at human development, or either the raising of a child, or the kind of evolutionary overview of our development as a species, storytelling, we know, has been around since antiquity. We know, in fact, that that cavemen told stories. We have evidence of them carving stories of their adventures and their hunting and so forth into walls. So we know that this function has been there, and I would assert that's because what defines us as human beings is our storytelling. But you can see this history, and some people would say about that that's really what we did to pass on information from generation to generation, especially values and what's important in terms of being human. Dogs have instincts, animals have instincts, but human beings are complex, and we're passing so much on that we're not passing on, they're saying instinctually, but we're passing it on through the stories that we tell and pass on to our children. The only problem that I have with that premise about, that theory about human development and the evolution of humanity, is that when you look at the stories that are passed on, a lot of our ancient stories, most of them are incredibly violent. I mentioned about the movie The Matrix being violent, but the fact of the matter is the classic stories that have, think of the fairy tales. Think of, you've got foxes eating girls, and people being, some of them they're just gruesome. Cinderella, the original Cinderella, not the Disney version, but the stepsisters actually slice off part of their foot to fit it into the slipper. I mean, there's just so much blood and gore in so many of these stories that you have to wonder, is this how we're passing on values to generation? So, that calls into question, makes me doubt that that's really been the main function of story over the our ancient history. But you look at how children develop, and they can barely speak, and they start to tell stories, and their stories in play are quite fanciful, and by the way, quite violent also. If you listen, they're also about this person fell off this, and they're full of horror and drama if you listen to them. Especially boy stories, but also girl stories. They just are full of all kinds of outrageous, violence, essentially. And but one of the interesting things about it is that they, as they grow, the stories that they tell become, in fact, more civilized and socialized and so forth. But an interesting thing is there's a point at which we recognize that children are starting also to lie, which is to blur the line between what's true and what's made up. And so you've heard me talk before about this idea that when a hero leaves the old world and goes into the world of adventure, they become, in fact, a fish out of water. And the fish out of water idea also is ancient. It comes from Chaucer. That's the earliest reference we know. He says, a monk who is out of the cloister is like a fish who is out of water. So there's this. So there's an analogy, and basically, if you ask a fish, if you were to be able to talk to a fish, take it out of the water and say, how's the water? He'd say, what water? What's water? I mean, if he was in the water, because they're always in it. They've always been in it. Look around, and it's like it disappears to them, right? It's always there. It kind of reminds me of Star Wars when Obi-Wan Kenobi is trying to explain the Force to Luke Skywalker. He says, it's always around us. It shapes us. It's kind of like talking to a fish about water. But the question is, we're not talking about the Force, the supernatural thing, but the question would be, what is the analogous force or phenomenon for a human being? What is it that we're sort of lost in? If we're a fish out, if we're a fish out of water, what's the water? And it's easy to see that it's the culture that we've left, you could say, but I would suggest and assert that it's actually story, one story or another, but that in fact human beings, we live in a sea of story. Now it's hard to kind of get this at first, but you start to examine it, you start to question, where the beliefs and the assumptions that we're operating from come from. If you ask, as Robert Hollis always says, how do you know that? If you start to doubt and question the claims that people are making and that your own mind seems to be making, you can start to dissect and pull apart some of these stories that we're living in, and then it starts to become more increasingly obvious that we're just swimming in the world of story. And why it's important to do this is because if the hero is going to have a whole new life, if the hero is going to actually step out of old ways of being and learn completely new ways of being, he or she has got to shed old beliefs and old ways of looking at things. But see, these become blind spots and we don't even see that we believe them. I tell the story of a friend of mine who has been single, and he's just such a catch, and he's so, he's handsome, he's well off, he's, he cooks and takes care of himself, and he's not married. And, I say to him, why aren't you, hooking up with him? He says, women only want me for my money. Well, so obviously he's had a bad experience, but you see how he's living inside that story? He's living inside a blind spot called women only want me for my money. And so he doesn't, it's a vicious circle because he never lets anybody get close to him, close enough, because immediately he already, puts this out that they only want him for his money. And so it's a trap. He can't escape, and as a result, he's unhappy because he can't seem to find somebody to spend his life with. So we all have these, and they're blind spots. We can see them in others around us, but we can't see our own. And there are stories, there are beliefs about our limitations and how we got to be who we are. There's stories about our parents and our teachers and our families and life and God and all of these things. Don't take this to mean that I'm trying to raise doubts about God or anything like that. No, I'm just saying that our particular beliefs, they don't even, if you were to call them beliefs, you'd have a little more facility with dealing with them, but they don't live like that for us. They live as reality for us. And that's what this process of going on an adventure brings up, of having a mentor. They're able to see outside of our sea of stories, and they're able to see that which stories are actually running our lives. And as a result, they're able to dig in there and actually have some facility with us to discover them and to be freed of them and finally have some choice about them. So that's the whole overview. That's the process. I hope, I love the Lily Tomlin line. She says, you can't expect insights, even the good ones, to leave you understanding everything. But I figure, hey, it's worth it if it leaves you confused in a higher way. So I hope I left you confused in a higher way. But I'll continue to share about this. Ask me questions, interact with me about it, and I'll bring some clarity to the conversation and some examples. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye for now. Keep telling your story. Bye-bye.